Guess where he invited me to go to lunch?
Where?
Luby's. And Luby's is a cafeteria.
This is Kirk Franklin, Grammy Award-winning gospel singer and songwriter in Start to Finish, a podcast that chronicles the life and ministry of Dr. Tony Evans. Kirk is talking about the first time he had lunch with Dr. Evans.
Like you go and you stand in line and say, yeah, let me get the green beans. Yeah, let me get the sweet potatoes. Yeah, let me, you know what I mean? He's passing this huge mega church, but took me to a cafeteria like in school. And at some point, I don't know if it was then or the next time, I asked myself, what do you want with me? Because at that time, I was used to being used. What do you want with me? And that kind of shook him. And he kind of smiled, giggled a little bit. He said, I don't want nothing. And he said this to me. I see a man that if his inside could ever catch up with his outside, he'd be an incredible man of God. He said that to me.
Wow.
Yep. That was the beginning of me wanting to chase everything he had. And I was 28 then, and I'm 53 now. And I'm chasing probably even harder now.
And nothing's even wrong. And nothing's even I just want to tell the world that I sing because. I sing because. And I sing because. I sing because. Can I get a witness in here? His eyes on despair. That's the reason why. That's the reason why. Any believers in here, can you say glory?
There's something powerful in the picture of an older man speaking truth into the life of a younger man in a way that calls him up to something greater, something brighter, something glorious, especially in a world when fatherhood has fallen on hard times.
Tony Evans, even though his experience was not like mine, but he said to me one day, transformative statement. He said, it's because he knew I didn't have a dad, knew how I was raised, once we started getting close. He said, it's hard to know God's love as a father when you've never had one.
According to research from Brad Wilcox, the percentage of boys living apart from their biological father has almost doubled since 1960, from about 17% to 32% today. Now, 12 million boys are growing up in families without their biological father. Wilcox writes, too many young men are floundering and falling behind in one way or another. But it's not just the problem of not having a father in the home. It's also the lack of strong men as role models. It's the loss of opportunity for men to socialize and enjoy close friendships. It's the disappearance of traditional markers of moving from boyhood to manhood. And all of this is happening in a lonely society that too often sees masculinity as a problem rather than a gift. Masculinity is a word now synonymous with descriptors like toxic and problematic, instead of a glorious and courageous calling. Leadership that comes from an inner sense of security and steadfastness, what Australian church leader Mark Sayers calls a non-anxious presence. That's what drew Kirk Franklin to Dr. Tony Evans.
It's because the culture is changing, the landscape, just the climate, and this man is still unwavering.
Wow.
He's unwavering. I asked him one day, I said, you never stress. I never see you bugging out. I never see you stressed about something. I don't ever see you, because I'm always, I said, I never see you stressed. I said, what is it? We're sitting in front of the house. And he said, I believe in the sovereignty of God. There are two men that I've always wanted to be like. I've always wanted the character, integrity of Billy Graham and Tony Evans.
All across the spectrum, you find commentators chattering away about the crisis of manhood in the wake of gender confusion, the denigration and disparagement of men traditionally involved in men's work, and the quest for significance and identity among men who seem to be lost and lonely in our strange new world. In a recent book, Of Boys and Men, cultural observer Richard Reeves calls out the negative views often associated with masculinity. The problem with men, he writes, is typically framed as a problem of men. It is men who must be fixed, one man or boy at a time. This individualistic approach, he says, is wrong. In other words, there are bigger forces at work here. How else do we reckon with the fact that men account for almost 3 out of 4 deaths of despair from overdose or suicide? And yet, in 2019, the American Psychological Association blamed the problems with boys on the concept of traditional masculinity, which got defined as anti-femininity, achievement, seeking to avoid the appearance of weakness, and adventure, risk, and violence. But is that really traditional masculinity? Are historically masculine traits merely culturally conditioned? Why is adventure and achievement or risk problematic? What happens in a society where markers of manhood, the passing from adolescence into adulthood, become obscured, where men stagger forward without mentors or friends? What happens to a society that pathologizes competition, achievement, roughness, and the aggression required to protect the weak or pursue what's good? How does it make sense to push back against toxic expressions of masculinity without a clear picture of actual manliness, a positive vision that shatters the caricatures? And how can the church be part of the solution to this crisis? I'm Trevin Wax, Vice President of Research and Resource Development at the North American Mission Board. You're listening to Reconstructing Faith. In this series, we address different challenges facing the church today, offering perspective from church history and the global church, so that we meet this moment with a posture of faith, not fear, through the power of the Spirit. I hope you'll join me on this journey and consider what you can contribute to the task of restoring and rebuilding, working toward a healthier body of Christ in the days ahead. This is the 3rd episode of Season 2, Boys to Men for Mission.
What happened to men? Men used to build cities just so we could burn them down. I got her haircut by a guy named Hank.
This is Tim Allen in the role of Mike Baxter on the popular sitcom Last Man Standing.
But modern man, what do? You run from stuff. Responsibility, fatherhood. You can't even change a tire. A tire!
Why don't you get off the couch, you moron, and go outside? You'll see something bright. It's called the sun. It's like a tanning bed, but it's free.
There's no shortage of commentary out there about manhood and masculinity. Some of it builds on cultural stereotypes for the sake of humor. Others claim that masculinity is whatever you decide it to be. Historically, an organization like the Boy Scouts offered a pathway toward manhood, a vision of the good life that brought together nature and nurture, and lifted up a moral vision to be pursued and cherished. Spending time outdoors with others in friendship was a way of traveling the ancient path of wisdom and virtue. What is wisdom? Learning how to flourish by living according to the grain of the universe. What is virtue? Choosing patterns of life that lead to the development of moral intuitions and character growth. And so the Boy Scouts focused on camaraderie, on learning skills and tying knots, on showing honor and learning respect. The point was to bring yourself in line with the way the world works. Our society used to include multiple pathways of moral formation, of learning to live within the groove of nature, taking our place in the world we are called to cultivate. The church occupied a central role here, and even entertainment played a part, though sometimes in overly idealized versions. In seeking to help point young people toward a path of virtue, the church often stepped in. Look to the history of the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, or the organizations that arose with goals similar to the Boy Scouts. But in the latter part of the 20th century, many of these norms and paths, these visions of the good life, were portrayed as stifling, their confines too narrow. As the culture changed, the church did as well. In some cases, these markers for moving from boyhood to manhood disappeared. The church was part of the cultural disintegration of pathways for men's growth, leadership, and friendship, too often failing to set forth a compelling vision of redeemed masculinity. In other cases, the church was reactionary, reaching for cultural stereotypes of traditional masculinity and baptizing them as if they were biblical. The challenge we face today is a world in which paths either no longer exist, or the ones that remain are covered over. The goal of life, we're told, is to branch out and blaze our own trails. It may feel freeing to reject the confining and restricting aspects of the ancient paths, but in this world, we lose the significance of living within those boundaries, the sense of security that comes from paths that provide stability and joy to people. And you know the best way to describe losing sight of a path? It's called being lost.
See the road that lies ahead. I can see the love and the sorrow. Bright fields of joy, dark nights awake in a stormy bed. I want to go with you, but I can't follow. So keep to the old
It seems to me that we need to do a little history if we're going to understand how we got here as a culture. How has our understanding of masculine virtue and toxic masculinity evolved over the centuries? We may need to look back before we can look forward.
In the 19th century, for the first time ever in human history, women were considered morally superior to men. And we have to realize how novel this was.
This is Professor Nancy Pearcey. She is a scholar in residence at Houston Christian University and the author of several acclaimed books, including Total Truth and Love Thy Body. Her newest is The Toxic War on Masculinity, which is an intriguing and insightful look at the history of how manhood has been viewed in times past and how the church has responded, both in good ways and bad.
All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, people had assumed that men were morally superior. They thought that the insight into right and wrong was a rational insight, and they thought men were more rational, and therefore men were more virtuous. And so this was completely new in the 19th century, that for the first time women were considered morally and spiritually superior to men. And so I would call this one of the misconceptions, because society began to accept that men were naturally less moral and less spiritually oriented, that they were naturally more prone to sin and vice. If you say that men are naturally more immoral, less attuned to the spiritual truths, you are basically saying, we're just going to accept this as man's essential nature. And the line in the 19th century was that men would come home from the rough and tumble world of business and commerce and come home to their morally superior wives to be reformed, refined, and renewed. So I would say that was definitely one of the misconceptions historically, that men are just naturally less spiritual and more prone to sin. And another important turning point in my book is the rise of Darwinism. It also led to a very negative view of the male character. Darwinian thinkers began to say the men who won out in the struggle for survival would by necessity be ruthless, rugged, barbarian, savage, brutal, and even predatory. And so the idea then, according to Darwinian thinkers, was to get in touch with your true manhood was to get in touch with the beast within. In other words, in the past, people had urged men to live up to the image of God in them. But Darwinian thinkers said, no, you discover your authentic manhood by living down to your animal nature. That is your true, authentic nature. And so it did cause a lot of people to redefine manhood in terms of biological lust for power and dominance and control.
I think there are a lot of listeners who their understanding of traditional manhood, womanhood is that the man is the breadwinner who leaves the home to go bring in income, and the woman is the one who keeps the house. And one of the things that's so fascinating about your book that I think will be a revelation to a lot of people is the fact that that's not actually a traditional view.
So before the Industrial Revolution, fathers worked with their wives and children every day in and day out on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural ethos at the time, the expectation on men tended to stress his caretaking role because he's working with his wife and children all day. He had to be patient, he had to be loving. In fact, the concept of authority even had a very specific meaning at the time. It meant the person responsible for the common good. In other words, I look out for what's good for me, you look out for what's good for you, but who looks out for the common good of the marriage, the family, the church, civil society, and so on? That person was supposed to be disinterested, to use the favorite word of the time, meaning he was not supposed to look out for his own interest because his job was to look out for the interest of the whole. Where did we lose all that? We lost it with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution takes work out of the home, and of course, fathers had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, they were not working with people that they loved and had a moral bond with, but instead they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And already then you start to see the literature change. People began to complain, to protest that the men were changing, that their character was changing. They were becoming more individualistic, ambitious, look out for number one, make the career your idol, get ahead at all costs, greedy and acquisitive. This was some of the language of the day. People were concerned that the male character was changing. As the material conditions, the economic conditions changed, men's character changed as well. And so they didn't use the word toxic, but some of the language was just as strong as anything that you hear from radical feminists today as they described their concern over the changing male character. This was also, the Industrial Revolution provided the material conditions for secularization.
I'm a classic television fan, and I was watching an episode of The Dick Van Dyke Show from 1962. The episode kicked off with one of the writers in the show talking about an article that they'd read called The Decline of the American Man.
Gee, I remember when my father came home, my mother always had his favorite dinner all ready for him, and she'd get his pipe and slippers, and us kids had to address him as sir.
So?
So today you come home, your wife's out playing canasta, you got to defrost your own dinner, and you're lucky if the kids talk to you at all.
Buddy, you're exaggerating.
Yeah, you see, you're brainwashed. We're all brainwashed. I read a magazine article said we're living in the decline of the American male.
Well, I don't feel I've declined.
No, huh? The only thing a guy can do around the house today without asking his wife's permission is take out the garbage.
What was fascinating to me was the fact that here we're flashing back in time 60 years, and there's a conversation going on in 1962 about men no longer being men who really rule their homes and whatnot. Is it just going to be a perennial generational concern that we are, in some way or another, are debating the meaning of manhood, the meaning of fatherhood, what it means to, I know the debates shift over time, but is this just going to constantly be a perennial conversation that every generation will wrestle with at some level?
Well, certainly at some level. But I think it is different today because there is a clear distinction between the colonial era. Both men and women worked from home, and both men and women could therefore combine economically productive work with raising their children. In fact, fathers were considered the primary parent in the sense that men were considered more responsible for their children's spiritual and intellectual development. Clearly, mothers have a greater impact in infancy, but fathers were considered the most important parent, especially for spiritual and intellectual training. In fact, most of the literature that addressed parents, sermons, pamphlets, books, advice manuals, were addressed to fathers. This was a huge surprise when I read that. Because today, if you go into a bookstore, obviously most of the books on parenting are written to mothers. But at that time, all the books were addressed to fathers, maybe sometimes both parents, but usually fathers. You didn't start getting the shift to mothers until after the Industrial Revolution, because when fathers were removed from the home, it was such a cultural shock.
I really was intrigued by the title of your book because toxic is the adjective that gets applied to masculinity these days. almost to the point that some people can hardly differentiate between masculinity and toxicity. But you use toxic and masculinity in the title of your book, but you apply toxic to the war. So it's the toxic war on the true masculinity, or what masculinity should be. So I wonder if you can help us understand what, based on your research and your study of scripture and theology, what are the elements of masculine expression that you would say are sinful and toxic in some way?
I grew up in a very abusive home. My father was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they will often ask, was it open hand or closed fist? And it was closed fist. He was punching and kicking, and he was very open about it. He didn't say, do this or I'll spank you. He said, do this or I'll beat you. So I grew up with obviously a very toxic understanding of masculinity. And it is one reason that I left the faith. I was raised in a Lutheran home, walked away from my Christian upbringing in high school. And in the introduction to the book, I say, in a sense, I've been writing this book my whole life because I've had to be working on what is a positive and biblical view of masculinity. Of course, I went totally feminist for several years. I read every feminist book out there, especially all the formative ones. And it was really my visit to L'Abri where I started finally getting answers to the question of masculinity.
L'Abri in Switzerland is a study center begun by Francis and Edith Schaeffer, where individuals would gather to seek answers to honest questions about God and the significance of human life.
And of course, Francis Schaeffer is known for his apologetics ministry. And that's what I first was drawn to, because by then I'd become an agnostic for many years. About halfway through high school, I had given up my Christian faith. So it was first of all the apologetics that I was very impressed by. And it is the reason I became a Christian again. But also at L'Abri was a psychiatric social worker. Her name was Sheila Bird, and we called her Birdie. And Birdie helped me to realize I could not just walk away from my childhood trauma, that I had to work through it, because I thought I could just walk away. I left home. I was going to create a blank slate and build my whole self over again, build up my whole personality from scratch. Well, that doesn't work, obviously. But at L'Abri, I got both the intellectual side of Christianity as a whole worldview as intellectually defensible, but I also got the spiritual, emotional, and psychological healing. So I had this really rich understanding of Christianity, right from the beginning. So I have a couple of chapters on domestic violence in the book, so I'm very clear that there is a toxic form of masculinity. But one of the things I had to do with people's first question was, well, what do you think the differences are between men and women then? So that had to go at the front of the book too. Well, obviously, let's start with biology. Men are bigger, stronger, faster. They have more fast twitch muscles. I had to learn that word. It means they can react more quickly. Because of testosterone, they are more aggressive, more risk-taking. And we have to see these as good. These are the basic biological givens. And so clearly, this is how God made men. And we have to acknowledge these as good when directed toward ethical ends.
In her book, Professor Piercy contrasts the good man with the real man and points to another sociologist's experiment.
So this sociologist is not a Christian, but he's very well known in his field, and so he gets invited to speak all around the world. And he came up with a very clever experiment where he would ask young men two questions. First, he would say, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And the sociologist said all around the globe, young men had no trouble answering that question. They would say things like honor, integrity, duty, sacrifice, do the right thing, stand up for the little guy, be a protector, be a provider, be generous, be responsible, and so on. And he would ask them, well, where'd you learn that? And they would say, well, it's just in the air we breathe. Or if he was in a Western country, they would say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would follow up with a second question. He'd say, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, oh no, that's completely different. And they would say, that means things like be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. And so the sociologist concluded that men are caught between these two scripts. As we would say, they're made in God's image, and they do know what it means to be a good man. They have an inherent, innate knowledge. Romans 2, right? We all have a conscience. But they feel social pressure to live up to the real man script, and which can lead to more toxic outcomes, right? Especially if disconnected from the moral ideal of the good man. The second list, the real man, tended to be the traits we now consider more dangerous, toxic, and harmful. And so what I conclude from that is when we talk to men, well, most of them don't respond well to being called toxic, right? No one would. So it makes more sense to see, can we tap into that innate knowledge of what it means to be a good man? Can we encourage and support and affirm that? And it gives us a much more positive way of approaching these issues. It also tells us that Christianity is not contrary to men's nature, right? When we ask men to live up to a biblical standard, we're not asking them to do something that's contrary to their nature. It's in tune, it's in harmony with who God created them to be. And so we are actually showing them what it means to be truly authentic manhood.
This is a key point, and one that often goes unsaid in the church, that there's an aim, a goal, a nature of things to which we as human beings both aspire and conform. This goes not just for humans in general, but for men specifically. And it raises a question for the church. Is it possible we've gotten caught in two different traps here? I wonder if in some of our churches we've fallen for the myth of the real man, the self-centered script of manhood, to the point we've reached for all sorts of wrong-headed notions of masculinity and tried to dress them up with Christian wrapping paper so as to make the church more attractive to men. And I wonder if in other churches we've railed so much against the self-centered script of the real man without offering a better vision of the good man, that we've made men think they've got to sacrifice something of their true God-given masculinity at the door to be a faithful Christian. As if imitating Jesus makes you somehow less of a man. The key point here is that there is such a thing as positive, glorious, biblical masculinity, and it's in harmony with man's nature. Yes, it gets twisted and distorted by our sin, but there's a real and enduring good there, an aim to pursue. If the church is going to respond wisely to the challenges facing men today, we'll need to get a better picture of what masculinity is aiming for. More on that in a moment.
And what we need are a group of people who stand in the midst and let hell know what heaven looks like.
Dr. Tony Evans is a world-famous preacher, author, and pastor.
We call them alternatives.
He always lands on lists like 12 most influential preachers.
People who have decided to answer Jesus' prayer that thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
He was a high-energy young man with a work ethic to match.
At 18, I was involved in an evangelistic crusade. It was led by an evangelist called B. Sam Hart. And he had an event coming up in Guyana, South America. And I guess he saw my energy. He says, if you get me a meeting with the mayor, I'm going to send you to South America. I got him a meeting with the mayor. That's when he sent me to South America.
Listen to Tony's story from the very beginning. Start to finish, the life and ministry of Dr. Tony Evans. Episodes drop soon. Subscribe wherever and however you listen.
But there's more to what your words than what their human eyes can see. Oh, I say the measure of a man is not how tall you stand, how wealthy or intelligent you are. 'Cause I found out the measure of a man, God knows that he understands. For he looks inside to the bottom of your heart, and what's in the heart to find.
We're living in a time of desperate confusion about gender and sex. All the heresies of our time are primarily anthropological heresies, right? What is a man? What is a woman? What's the difference between it, and why does it matter?
This is Shane Morris. He's a senior writer at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, He hosts the Upstream podcast and is the author of many Breakpoint commentaries and columns.
Again and again, I see the modern evangelical church make this mistake that the gospel is some kind of alternative to natural truths. It's some kind of alternative to God's created world. It's not. The gospel is the good news of how God is restoring his created world. And so just as the gospel doesn't obviate the principles of mathematics, nor does it need to contain them, we don't say that the Pythagorean theorem is part of the gospel, that nevertheless doesn't diminish the truth of the Pythagorean theorem. I think there are truths about men and women, the sexes, the genders, masculinity, femininity, that are not comprehended within the gospel, but are nonetheless complemented by and restored by the gospel. Like how we live as sexed beings is restored by the gospel. These two things aren't in conflict. So instead of pitting the sort of message of all the masculine expressions of these virtues against the message of the good news of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and ascension, we should see the complementarity there. Because as Christians, we see where it connects. We don't have to spin it around in a circle like Peterson does. We can actually take the hand that God has reached down to us from heaven and say, we have the transcendent truth.
Notice how Shane's response builds on something Professor Piercy said. A key point that often goes unsaid. There's something about masculinity and femininity woven into the fabric of creation, so that when a man becomes a Christian, he doesn't become less of a man, but more of one. Of course, the challenges facing men are not new, no matter how they manifest themselves today.
Well, the Proverbs, warn about the path of the foolish man, and it looks like it centers around kind of laziness, sexual looseness, poor decisions with money, that sort of thing, like not controlling your drink and your food. So those are always temptations. I mean, they go back to the time of Solomon and beyond. But I think that there's been a disintegration in the social scripts that led men out of those things into some kind of meaningful achievement. But now we're living in a peak of individualism. We're at the time of most expressive individualism ever. And you wrote about this as well in your book, Rethink Yourself, where just the self has become the locus of all reality and everything orbits around the self now. So we have to express ourselves, and that's the ultimate meaning of life. So of course it's going to be hard to impose or suggest scripts upon young men's lives that are going to lead them up and into higher values beyond themselves in a time when everyone's telling them, look, the highest value is just yourself and that you express yourself.
Well, there's certainly a new aspect, at least for us generationally. There's something very culturally different. When you read the response of most young men when it came to World War I and World War II, I mean, when the Great War broke out across Europe and in the United States, I mean, you had young men lying about their ages so they could go fight. Not lying about their ages so that, they would appear younger than they were so that they didn't have to go fight, which is fascinating to think about and is the kind of thing that you say, that's not the norm today.
Or what was it, Pearl Harbor, where one of them cheats on his eye exam to try to get into they lie about their age and then they cheat on an eye exam to try to get into the service so they can go fight.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah, so something in the cultural air has shifted in that seems so strange to us today. I've been saying for a while now that if you're a minister of the gospel and you're not asking why some men are gravitating toward books and podcasts promoting stoicism, or the frank talk of Jordan Peterson, or the bodybuilder training types on Instagram, I think if you're not asking those questions, you're missing a major piece of the cultural puzzle right now. Because men are all around us are looking for a challenge, and I don't think young men will take seriously a church that doesn't call them to something.
So when I've written about this, I've said that the best of the masculinity gurus in the secular world are appealing to young men because they're calling them toward something that is innate and natural to being a man, and that is not actually opposed to the gospel. In fact, is assumed by and in many senses restored by the gospel. Okay, so and this is what I mean by anthropological heresies, is that even in the church, we've obscured or forgotten the fact that men and women are different. And they're not just different on the level of plumbing. Like they are very different sorts of beings. They were created to work in harmony and complement one another, not to be replicas of one another. This is the uniform testimony of the Bible, and Christian history, backs this up, and theological reflection as well. So I think when a Jordan Peterson comes along and he tells you things like, create small, habits in your life that take dominion of the small spaces that are currently under your control. Make decisions right now that draw you out of the malaise of meaninglessness and nihilism and toward something that is meaningful. Shoulder responsibility where you're at and create meaning out of the darkness. And then you will find that people begin to look to you, trust you, follow you, and you can bless them too with the meaning that you're creating. Like, you can be the kind of person who rolls back that nihilistic despair for everyone around you, and not just the men around you. And that all comes through assuming responsibility and living as if there's actual meaning in the world. And, he grounds this in like evolutionary psychology and our supposed common ancestry with lobsters and all that. Like, there's the stuff you can make fun of. But look, I have no problem saying if we're created by the same God as lobsters, there's gonna be a lot of common chemistry in there, bro. So you take it one step at a time. You do something small and virtuous and, frankly, masculine, because he does encourage people in that direction. Although it's kind of weird that Peterson has been labeled, and he's reflected on this. Like, why is he labeled a guru for men in particular? Well, if you look back at his stuff, he never actually self-consciously positioned himself that way. It was just that men were the ones who overwhelmingly responded to his message and came up to him like crying after events saying, "You saved me from suicide," because, well, the advice resonated with them more than it did with young women. So that's one obvious thing.
I wanted to dig a little deeper into the popularity of the neo-Stoic writers, like Ryan Holiday and Jocko Willink, and the rise of fitness culture among some men nowadays. I realize there are places where this emphasis on physical strength can become an idol, but surely there's a good and right longing, something healthy in the desire to be healthy. I talked about this with my friend Noah Oldham, pastor at August Gate Church in Belleville, Illinois, and the senior director for culture and care at the Sin Network.
In my early 20s, God called me to plant a church. And so I left my hometown and my home church, and I moved to St. Louis, and I went through this process of several years of just giving all of my energy, my time, my attention to seeing this church planted and disciples made and the city reached. And then I found myself at 35 years old, after having given years to this call of kingdom work and church planting, that my body was broken. I was in the worst shape I'd ever been, heavier than I'd ever been, and I couldn't even teach my son's t-ball team to run to first base because my back hurt so bad when I tried to exercise. And I just knew that I was at this breaking point where something had to shift, that if I was going to lead people, if I was including lead other men, I had to be an example that they could follow. I didn't have to be the best of the best, but I needed to pursue health in so many other areas of my life that I had been neglecting up to that point. And so what I've found is, not only as I've been on my own health journey, but I've helped over 100 other pastors on a health journey. I've noticed that it's always connected to a lack of discipline in their spiritual life. And as they begin to peel back the layers and pursue health in the areas of nutrition and physical fitness, that these other areas that were there spiritually begin to be exposed and dealt with at a true, deep, and authentic level.
Yeah, I know it's interesting. We laugh about certain sins in ways we would never laugh about other sins. I mean, and one of the 7 deadlies, according to the Christian tradition, is gluttony, right? Which is really, it's a lack of self-mastery in that sense. And I want to make sure, people understand what you're saying and what I'm saying. Like, this is not a weight issue to where it's like, well, this person's more overweight or this person's underweight or this person's, I mean, gluttony can be a problem for a skinnier person. Just like there could be all sorts of reasons why someone is, but like you can't make simple judgments and be like, well, this person looks like this, therefore spiritually they must be this, or they must, there's a lot of complexity to the nature of our bodies and whatnot. And yet, this is something that when Paul talks about disciplining, the body, and he's talking about, he does make the same spiritual, physical connection analogy that you're making here. I was talking with a friend of mine who, during his 20s, went through a season in which he was just basically obsessed with like sort of perfecting his physical body. I mean, just to the point that, he, talking to me about this, said like basically it became his sort of athletic performance, his physical appearance became such an obsession that he went to the other extreme on this. Like his workout was his worship. This was his life, to the point he had to really scale it back. And now, now he's in his mid-30s. physically fit, still in shape, but not with that sort of level of attention and focus and obsession on something like that. So I wonder, like, where do you see the dangers of men? Because this can happen as well, like men equating their masculinity with their physical prowess or their physical fitness or their, the amount they can bench press or whatever, how much they run or whatnot.
Yeah, I think there's two ditches. There's a ditch on either side. One is God doesn't care about our bodies, and the other is my body is God. And if I can perfect this, I become God. And bodybuilding culture can do that. But if you're in fitness very long, you realize that your body begins to fall apart. You can only lift so much until things begin to hurt. You can only go so far until you have to use performance-enhancing drugs to get to another level. There's always somebody that's stronger, and there's always something about you that is weak and flawed. And people will turn that into a chase for perfection. But on my best days, I choose to see that as an opportunity to bring God glory, but still rely on dependence on Him for anything that I can do.
There's something about our creatureliness that comes about in that. Like, yes, the body is an amazing thing and we give God praise for it, but then at the same time too, like we're getting older. Like our bodies are going to wear out. You're not going to be able to do what you do today, probably 15 years from now at the same level. Like you need to recognize that there's a limit to the body and that I do think there are lessons there for us recognizing that we are creatures that can only do so much. And that there's a sense of, it's not a manly resignation, but it's a manly recognition that we are embodied creatures and there's only so much we can handle.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think something that really inspires me about the concept is we have this treasure in jars of clay, and we have this gospel message in these structures that are just dust and they're wasting away. But at the same time, they hold a treasure. And God wants us to use that treasure, to spread that treasure, to share that treasure with others for the rest of our lives.
So a follow-up question for all of this. How do you steer young men away from some of the bad examples of workout culture that are online? Like the self-help gurus who are basically, I'm thinking of like the Andrew Tates of the world and others, like where there's all sorts of immorality. At one level, there's workout culture, but at the other level, it's like complete unrestraint when it comes to sexual sin or all sorts of stuff. Like, how do you make sure, because a lot of young people are intrigued by, coaches and people who will basically tell them constantly, this is what you can do to your body. This is how you can live. This is how you can, how do you steer them away from some of the bad role models to some of the better ones?
I think one of the greatest ways you steer young men away from bad role models is by becoming a good role model. That you try to live your life like Paul told Timothy, to watch your life and your doctrine. And that if you're a person that has good doctrine and you also have a life that, even if you're not the example, you are an example of somebody who is striving toward those things, they look at this caricature that's out there that's calling us to this crazy, unrealistic, and often unbiblical standard. And all of a sudden they say, no, there's a better way. And I know a better way by an example in my life. And I think that's one of the problems of not having good examples, enough good examples around us, is that young men are built to look for examples. They're meant to look to the generation before them. They're meant to be trained by their spiritual fathers and their biological fathers. And when we don't have them, they go looking for it elsewhere. And there's this brokenness of these daddy issues that come up, and they lead to men trying to find what ends up resulting in toxic masculinity.
In my conversation with Noah, it becomes clear that the model man he is describing is someone who takes responsibility, who takes initiative, who steps up to the plate, who is willing to carry burdens seen and unseen in order to provide for others, who marshals and channels his strength in order to protect the weak and the vulnerable, and to lead in ways that bring order to a chaotic world. I asked Noah what this kind of masculine virtue looks like inside the church, where the virtues of manhood are transposed into a Christian key of self-sacrificing leadership, of faith, hope, and love.
I think about Hebrews chapter 11 and 12. Hebrews chapter 11 gives us the hall of faith and gives us all these names from the Old Testament. Look to them, look to them, look to them. But then the beginning of chapter 12, it says, but consider Jesus. And I think ultimately there's all these great examples that we have of those that are out in the world that love Jesus and follow Jesus and choose to pursue a biblical path of masculinity. But ultimately we've got to consider Jesus. And so helping young men and old men alike to look to Jesus and see the things that he said and the things that he modeled And then you have some people who follow Jesus very closely, like the Apostle Paul, not even married, giving his life for Jesus' bride and caring for others and taking responsibility. And then I think it's not only doing those things, Trevin, but it's showing joy in doing those things.
Noah is right to point us not only to Jesus, but also to the Apostle Paul. Just consider Paul's description of his ministry. He talks about beating his body and bringing it into submission, his hard work as an apostle, his suffering on behalf of his people, and being spent as he strenuously contends with all his energy. He describes himself as being poured out as a drink offering. And yet in all of this, he is joyful. He is constantly, even in prison, filled with joy. That means to be a man made in the image of God and remade in the image of Christ is not a drudgery of duty. It's about our joy. Christianity teaches us that the result of our love and service to others, as we pour ourselves out for the sake of others, as we work to provide and protect, as we sacrifice our own interests, we find joy. I asked Noah how we can inspire young men to capture a fuller vision of their own potential for joy in service.
I'm also a Little League baseball coach and a junior high baseball coach, and I like to find those athletes that have the ability to do more, but for whatever reason, they're not doing it. They're lazy, they don't believe in themselves, they never had anybody encourage them, and I come alongside them, I pull them one-on-one, and I tell them what can be, what I see in them. And it's amazing, almost to a kid, they rise to the occasion because someone told them what was true and what was possible. And I think in the church, that's what we got to do with young men. That you can lead your home. You can be a servant leader. You can protect and provide. You don't have to become all the pitfalls that generations have come before us and been. You can trust Jesus and you can look like Jesus as you serve and lead others.
We'll be right back. I'd like to tell you about something called Gen Send. Gen Send is not about the church of tomorrow or next week. It is about developing and deploying the generation that is living on mission today. The immersive opportunities provided through Gen Send experiences give students the ministry mindset needed to become people who give their lives for God's mission in the world. So, no matter where they end up in life, they are equipped to confidently make disciples and serve communities in need. Check out the free resources at gensend.org.
God has not created us and called us into the game of life as men to remain passive sitting on the bench. God has called us for greatness. He has called us to be great and godly fathers, great and godly husbands, great and godly students and co-workers. He has not called us to be satisfied with being dim lights, but rather bright lights that draw the attention of the culture. Could it be that our culture is devolving because men are complaining but not willing to be involved? Could it be that our marriages are failing because men are demanding submission from their wives but not willing to submit to God? Could it be that our young people are lost because men are siring kids but not taking the responsibility of raising them? Could it be that our churches are failing because men are sitting in church?
This is a spoken word from Jonathan Evans, one of the voices in the documentary Kingdom Men Rising. Jonathan raises a number of good questions that provide a challenge for men in our day. In order to change course, to step up and fulfill our purpose, we'd be wise to heed the example of King David, a man who imperfectly and sincerely pursued God, a man after God's own heart. We are called to something majestic, to respond to the love of God for us by loving Him with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength as men. Which means we are called not just to grit our teeth and do whatever we think proves our manliness, but to ask God to examine the inner depths of our hearts, to bask in our identity as sons of our Father, and to be about our Father's business because we love Him and we love the people He's entrusted to our care. Not long ago, I was meeting with some friends from across the country. We were talking about the need to call up young men to a spiritually disciplined way of life, grounded in the grace of the gospel. One of the pastors there said, if you're not providing a moral standard and vision to aspire to, a Christianity that's hard and takes effort, they're not going to take you seriously. A big part of this kind of mentoring will include personal and spiritual discipline. You can't call someone up toward a moral vision or the mission of God unless you're going to talk about habits. If you're not talking about phone use, about avoiding porn, about reading, about gaming, about physical fitness, about prayer, about social skills, about serving others, about idolatries, you're missing a big part of day-to-day spiritual leadership development. We've got to show the difference between the pull yourself up by your bootstraps, self-actualizing advice from the neo-Stoics of the world, and the spirit-filled drive towards spirit mastery, not self-mastery, of becoming like Christ. More than that, we've got to prepare young men to join together as comrades in arms, friends who love and support each other in the spiritual war we fight against the evil one. J.C. Ryle's little book of advice to young men in the 1800s startles the imagination.
Your enemy is restless. He never sleeps. He is always going around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. You may be careless about your souls, but he is not. He wants your soul to make you miserable, like himself, and he will have your soul if he can.
J.C. Ryle is clear. The way to lose the spiritual battle is not outright rebellion, but self-centered pleasures.
Is it better to be idle, frivolous, to live for your body, your selfishness, your lusts, and your pride? Or to spend and be spent in the glorious cause of usefulness to your fellow men, to be a blessing to your country and the world, to be the friend of the prisoner and the captive, to be the spiritual father of hundreds of immortal souls in heathen lands, to be a burning and a shining light, an epistle of Christ, known and read of all men, the inspiration of every Christian heart that comes across your path.
We cheat the next generation when we offer a version of the Christian faith that settles for moral mediocrity, when we could call them up to a vision of moral majesty. We are made in the image of God, and as we are remade in the image of Christ, our selfish impulses can be replaced by self-giving impulses that bring life to those around us.
Let's look a little closer at Joshua's declaration. He says, as for me.
This is Dr. Tony Evans offering a Kingdom Men declaration on Father's Day in 2020.
This decision cannot be made by somebody else for you. As a father, as a man, as a husband. You've got to make the decision. This is how I roll. This is where I'm coming from. I am first of all a Christian. I am first of all a follower of Jesus Christ. My first allegiance is to the God of the Bible, his way, his word, his wisdom, his will. As for me, now, in a culture in chaos, that can be a little tough decision because folks will want you to make their decision in order to be accepted, in order to be popular. Too many men today are like jellyfish. Jellyfish can be cute and colorful, but they have no substance, no backbone. They just go with the current. They don't take a stand. I don't mean being mean, but I do mean being clear that I follow Jesus Christ. Everybody else is saying who they follow. Why should we be ambiguous as men about who we follow?
When men rise up and fulfill their calling, the world is a better place. The church is stronger. The family is happier. The mission of God to extend the gospel to the nations goes forward. If the mission of God to seek and save the lost, if the mission of the church to extend the name of Jesus to the ends of the earth is not front and center in the lives of young men, some other mission will take its place. The mission to make a lot of money, the mission to bed a lot of women, the mission to climb the ladder of status, the mission to physically perfect one's body, the mission to make a name for oneself. But we can call young men up to something bigger. We can give young men a captivating vision of the kingdom of God. We can show young men how to cultivate rich and meaningful friendships. We can mark the passage of time as young men grow and mature. We can show the next generation what it looks like to leverage our lives for the mission, to deploy our skills and talents for the extension of God's kingdom. Whether that's through the workplace or the sports league or your church or community, all of us have a role to play. No one sits on the sidelines. It is good to be a man. It is good to fulfill God's intention for Adam, to keep the garden and subdue it, to fight against the thorns and thistles that show up as a result of sin. It is good to be a man who bows the knee to the man who saved us, the God-man, Jesus Christ, who rules the world as king. It is only in submission to King Jesus that sinful expressions of masculinity can be thwarted and redirected. I can't think of a better place than the church to offer a positive vision of manhood, to appreciate and encourage men in the silent yet heavy burdens they carry, to paint a picture of fatherhood, both physically and spiritually, to help men step into their inheritance as sons of God who carry the mantle and high calling to serve the world that Jesus gave his life for, to love our neighbors and fight for their good, to love our wives self-sacrificially and without restraint, to instruct our children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, to set aside the sins that entangle us and run the race with endurance, trusting that the Lord will help us leave a legacy for those who come behind us. Next time on Reconstructing Faith, we look at what I call the secret catastrophe facing the church today.
We need to continue to let others know the damaging impacts that pornography can have and is having on people, especially those who are seeking to love Jesus. And this has been confirmed and validated by solid research, but porn literally rewires our brains. Right? When we watch, we become aroused, and these hormones and chemicals start getting released in our brain and throughout our body. And this is an inherently good thing. But the problem is that these systems, they're meant to be turned on, so to speak, and indulged in the context of a marriage between one man and one woman. You know, that's God's design for marriage. But what's happening now is that porn is dehumanizing people. This dynamic, it doesn't stay online, it's spilling over into real life. So that you begin to see women or even men just as objects, not as people. Porn is actually teaching people. Like, people are thinking that pornography is legitimate and are learning to practice this in their own relationships.
Reconstructing Faith is a podcast powered by the North American Mission Board. In an upcoming episode, we plan to respond to comments or questions from listeners. You can participate by giving us feedback at resources@nam.net. That's resources@namb.net. If this podcast is helpful to you, it would be helpful to us if you'd leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening to and share it with your friends. Reconstructing Faith is written by Trevin Wax. Our show is produced and edited by Scott Slusher. Our sound design is composed, mixed, and mastered by Dan Phelps. Aaron Leslie handles audio editing and engineering. Story editing and consulting is by Amy Simpson. Please check out my book, The Thrill of Orthodoxy: Rediscovering the Adventure of Christian Faith. Until next time.